And we are back here in the studio, and we are back from a few-week break from the podcast. I am behind, and it's the first time that I've been behind so far in the podcast, so it's kind of stressing me out a bit. But I'm already about halfway through my next book, and the next couple books after that are not very long, so I definitely think we're going to get caught up. We're going to be back on schedule. My hope is by next week, which means within the next week and a half, we're going to be releasing an additional 3 episodes to catch up. But it all has to do with the fact that I got behind on our trip to Alaska. I expected to have a little bit more time to read because anybody who's been to Alaska knows that it rains quite a bit. But on our trip this year, I think in the 3 weeks that we were there, it only rained 1 day. So essentially, we just lived outside the entire trip, and we did tons of fun things, and I just never had any time to read. Not only that, but the book that I got stuck on was a doozy. So this week's book, and I should have just put this book down, moved on to the next one, and then came back to this book, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to read it in order. I don't know why. There's just something to do with my brain trying to keep things in order. I'm a very particular person. I get that from my dad, but I wanted to read this book next, and I thought I could do it, but this book was rough, and I don't know if I'm fairly certain that the fact that I was on vacation plays a part into why this book was so rough. But I think even outside of vacation and outside of travel mode and in my normal routine of reading, I think that this book still would have been rough. The book for this week is Catch-22, and Catch-22 is pretty widely regarded as one of the greatest books in the last 50 years and is on everybody's top 100 books to read, and it's one I would think it's pretty like culturally iconic. Like this idea of Catch-22 has become kind of a very common phrase. And I didn't know that it actually stemmed from this book. So this book kind of invented the idea of Catch-22. And it's a book that, again, comes very highly recommended by a lot of people that I've read other books from that I've really enjoyed. And I just couldn't get into it. So I'm going to go ahead and read the description for this book, and then we'll kind of start diving into why I was not the biggest fan of Catch-22. I didn't hate it, but just wasn't a huge fan. So here we go. 50 years after its original publication, Catch-22 remains a cornerstone of American literature and one of the funniest and most celebrated books of all time. In recent years, it has been named to the best novels list by Times, Newsweek, the Modern Library, and the London Observer. See, I told you, it's pretty well regarded. Set in Italy during World War II, this is the story of the incomparable malingering bombardier Yossarian, a hero who is furious because thousands of people he has never met are trying to kill him. But the real problem is not the enemy, it's his own army, which keeps increasing the number of missions that men must fly to complete their service. Yet if Yossarian makes any attempt to excuse himself from the perilous missions he is assigned, he will be in violation of Catch-22, a hilariously sinister bureaucratic rule. A man is considered insane if he willingly continues to fly dangerous combat missions, but if he makes a formal request to be removed from duty, he is proven sane and therefore ineligible to be relieved. This 15th century edition commemorates Joseph Heller's masterpiece with a new introduction by Christopher Buckley, a wealth of critical essays and reviews by Norman Mailer, Alfred Kaizen, Anthony Burgess, and others, rare papers and photos of Joseph Heller's personal archive, and much more. Here at last is the definitive edition of a classic world literature. Yep, that's exactly what this book was. Confusing. So if you did not understand my synopsis of this, and it's not my synopsis, this is on the back of the book. If you did not understand that synopsis, it's because that you wouldn't understand the entire book. The entire book is confusing from start to finish. And I've read a lot of reviews after finishing this book, because I really wanted to know, like, what kind of person enjoys this book, because it's not me. And I'm kind of a person who really does enjoy wartime books. I kind of fancy myself a fan of comedy, and this book kind of talks about being one of the funniest books ever written, and there's a lot of satire in it, and I don't know, I just was really wanting to like this book. But I think the overuse of confusion is what took me out of this book. So I want to read a review that I read on Goodreads that I think really summarizes a lot of how I feel about this book. And I just want to go ahead and read it. So it says, I think Heller was showing how war is chaotic by not writing in chronological order. You really have no idea what order events are taking place. I think he was showing how war is ridiculous by writing conversations like the one above. I'm not sure if any of his goals were to annoy the living hell out of his readers, but he annoyed me. 430 pages of absurdness is too much for me. Most of the characters were very one-dimensional. I could only distinguish between people by their names. Most of the good guys all had the same personalities, and all the bad guys had the same personalities, except one character ate peanut brittle and the other put crab apples in his cheeks. And that's exactly how I felt. I felt like there was definitely a purpose behind it being muddled and confusing. So the entire book is non-chronological. There's, I think from what I've researched, like 6 sections of the book over the course of almost 40 chapters. So the book is broken up in 40 chapters. Most of the chapters are named after individual characters. And also, as a side note, anybody who's listened to this podcast longer than 4 episodes knows that I just am terrible with names. I'm absolutely terrible with names. I forgot my wife's name on our first date and our second date. I had no idea, who she was. I ended up marrying her. So it's nothing like personal. It's an actual problem. Like, it's a mental illness that I have. I cannot remember names. I can remember faces. Like, if I see you one time walking across the street, I promise I can remember you forever. But if we've met 3 times and I plan on marrying you, I still can't remember your name. It is an actual problem. This book has over 50 named characters, and a lot of them have individual chapters associated to them. And there will be one chapter about a character in chapter, 2 or 3. And then the character swoops back in chapters, 25, 26, 27. And, you're supposed to be able to, bring these characters together. There's no, attempt to segue the characters in or reintroduce them. It's just constantly chaotic. And on top of all of these characters, we're just constantly bouncing between past, present, and future. And there's just so many different timelines going on within the book that you never know where you are within the story, who you're talking to, who you're talking about. I mean, there are obviously some main characters that stick with you throughout the book, but there's so many distractions going on while reading this book that it is absurdly confusing. And that to me made it really hard to get into. So it made it so that I just never really wanted to pick it up again. And it's not that it wasn't entertaining while I was listening to it, because while I was listening to it, I was like, haha. There were moments that I chuckled, and there were things that I was like, oh, that's very clever. There were quotes from the book that I think were absolutely brilliant. However, my gauge for a lot of books is like, while I'm not reading, do I think about it? And while I'm not reading, do I want to be reading? And this book was never one that I was like, oh, I'm so excited to pick Catch-22 back up. I just want to keep reading. And it was like, no, I don't want to pick it up again because I honestly don't know what's going on. I have no idea where I am. I have no idea what's going on within the story. I know that there's, a few main characters that I could kind of connect with, but for the most part, I had no idea and no connection to a large majority of the story. And again, I think some of that was done on purpose. I know that a lot of people think it was done on purpose, so I have no idea if it was like a stylistic thing that he did on purpose, or he was just a very terrible writer at, creating coherent stories, because I don't know of anything else that he's really written that's become very famous. He kind of seems almost like a one-hit wonder. I could be completely wrong with that, though. I kind of feel bad saying that Joseph Heller's a one-hit wonder without doing any of the research. So if that's not true, you can roast me in the comments. But I really don't think that he's written a whole lot. When doing some research on him, it really only talks about Catch-22. And that may be because that's, kind of the pinnacle of his work, and maybe he did write other works that were all right. I know he wrote kind of like a sequel to this book, but it's not really even close to the same level as this book. And so part of me thinks that, I don't know. Again, this was kind of his only work. It was his first book. So maybe some of this stuff was on purpose. Maybe some of it wasn't. Maybe he was just a poor writer. I have no idea. And it just doesn't come across, I don't know. It comes across as it could be either one. Like, he could be an absolute genius, absolute brilliant in writing the way that he did, but it also comes across as like, did he really know what he was doing when he set out to write this book? Like, he writes a chapter and then there is nothing. Then he just then writes another chapter. What it honestly feels like, what this book honestly feels like, is almost like it should have been written in a play form, because it would have been a lot easier to follow as characters kind of walked in and out of stage. And it also would have been able to, I don't know, the set behind the play. One second. Sorry about that. The set behind the play may have been able to give you some sort of cues and, clues as to where it is within the timeline of the story. I don't know. I think that a more visual representation of it would have been a little bit easier to follow. And so maybe that would help a little bit with this book, but I don't know. In addition, I felt like there is no clear plot line throughout the entire book. I mean, there's an overall theme of the book for sure. So obviously the theme of the book is almost an anti-war machine theme. I would say it's not anti-war. And the reason why I would say that it's not anti-war is because it never really talks poorly about the reason for going to war, which I think is very interesting, because this book is set during World War II. It's set during the last year of World War II. And I'm sure, again, if you're a fan of books in general, you know that the World War II genre is a very popular genre of books. But I honestly don't know. I think that the reason why World War II is such a very popular, historical fiction genre is because it's very cut and dry as to good versus evil. I mean, I think that I've heard it said that World War II is the last righteous war, is the way that I think it was put. I can't remember what it was called, but it was the last black and white war, because ever since then war's become, very ideology mixed and kind of muddled as far as purposes go. And then you have kind of the money side of things that always gets in there. And there's always just a little bit of, I don't know, kind of fudgery going on in war. Whereas World War II was really just, we're fighting bad guys. We're fighting Nazis. We're fighting bad guys, and that's what it is. And so to create a book that kind of pokes fun at war and pokes fun at the military in general, I felt like the choice of doing that in a World War II setting is very interesting and very difficult, in my opinion. So, I mean, I know that I've criticized this book as far as being kind of all over the place and very, I don't know, unorganized, which is also funny criticism coming from me, considering that my podcast is very all over the place and very unorganized. So I'm sure there's going to be somebody that points that out in the comments. But I think that choosing World War II as the opportunity to do that takes a lot of skill, because anybody looking at World War II, almost anybody, in fact, I've never heard of anybody looking at World War II and looking at it in any other light than just, we were there to do a good thing. It was very black and white. There were good guys and there were bad guys, and there was a mission to beat the bad guys, and that was it. So I thought that that was, he did a very good job. Joseph Heller did a very good job of writing a story in a way that is able to poke fun at the military, poke fun at the bureaucracy, poke fun at the way that the military complex works, poke fun at the missions, and at the same time, maybe not poke fun at the war itself. Because it's a war that I don't know that you could poke a whole lot of fun at. But it's definitely, and also because of that, because he doesn't poke fun of the event, the war, he's not poking fun at World War II. Instead, he's poking fun at something that's almost timeless. And I think that that's a lot of what I've read in some of the comments and some of the discussions about this book, is that these themes and these critiques of the military, they transcend his experience in World War II, and they transcend the story that's being told, because these are eternal truths, or not eternal truths, but these are continuing truths of bureaucracy, continuing truths of individuals' needs for, advancement and recognition, and this, giant military complex that has been built by, the world essentially. And it's something that continues to exist today. And so, this book is still to this day very applicable, which is another reason why people really, really regard this book as one of the, the greatest books of our generation, or of the last, 100 years is what I would say. But some interesting information about Joseph Heller. He was I guess, experienced this book firsthand. So in 1942, at the age of 19, Joseph Heller joined the U.S. Army Air Corps, and 2 years later, he was sent to Italy, where he flew 60 combat missions as a B-25 bombardier. He said, oh, sorry about that. Oh man, I'm going to sneeze. But during that time, and that's essentially what this book is portraying. So it portrays a couple different bombardiers, but primarily the primary character of this book is Yossarian, who also works out of the Mediterranean on the Italian front as a bombardier during the last year of World War II. And so a lot of the inspiration that Joseph Heller gained from this book, he got firsthand. So there are no specific characters from the book that he relates to specific individuals from his time of service. However, it's widely assumed that there are, definite inspirations from his experiences that led to this book. So after he got back from service, he decided to go back to school, and he ended up getting a bachelor's and I believe a master's in English. And he began writing this book, I think 6 years is what I read, after he completed his service. And then this book was eventually published in 1961. So it didn't come out, it was never meant to be an exact recount or even slightly biographical of his experience in Italy as a bombardier, but rather it served as mainly an inspiration for specific characters, specific events, and maybe a lens from which he could accurately critique this giant military organization from like a real firsthand view. So I thought that was interesting. I think that it's, makes the book a little bit more, I don't know how to put that, a little bit more worthwhile, but not that you have to have firsthand experience to write something worthwhile, but a little bit more real, if that makes sense, in that he also experienced that, that combat. Wow. Guys, please, 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 please forgive me for this episode of the podcast. I'm getting back into it. So if you've listened to the first episodes of the Bookly podcast, they were rough. And I think we are now on episode 51. I think as we record this is going to be episode 51. So things have gotten a little bit better. And then you take 3 weeks off, and just like everything else, you forget just about everything that you've learned. So my podcasting skills are basically out the window. We're starting off from ground zero again. And so just bear with me as we go through this one. I don't know that we're going to end up going the full hour on this episode of the podcast because it's, again, we're just working our way through it, but we'll get better. We'll get better. A couple interesting facts again about the novel. It won no awards upon its release. It had a very wide variety of acclaim when it was first released. There were some people who thought that it was, brilliant from the get-go. And then I read one review from I think it was the New Yorker or something like that essentially said that it felt like Joseph Heller was shouting on paper for 460 pages, which I felt like was a pretty accurate review. And I think even people who enjoy this book would agree that it kind of feels like Joseph Heller's just shouting on paper for 460 pages. There is a lot of that, and there's a lot of just absurdity and people getting mad over literally nothing at times in this book. And so, I think that the New Yorker meant that in more of a negative light, but even fans of the book will admit that it's kind of what makes this book so endearing is the constant absurdity and just the overall absurd nature of this book. So, there were some people though that really, really, really liked this book. So Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird, said that it was the only war novel that she's ever read that made any sense, which is crazy because this book makes almost no sense the entire way through. But I think that that's what, for somebody who is trying to understand what it's like to experience war, and also to try to make sense of, what it would be like to go to war, because I think from somebody who's never served, and I have never served in any war position, I do listen to a lot of podcasts from individuals who have served. I read a lot of books from people who have served. I've watched a lot of movies, and I know that that doesn't give me any right to speak on behalf of individuals who have served in the military. However, it does give me a right to speak on behalf of people who imagine what it would be like to serve in the military. And so from all of everything that I've imagined, I can't imagine that it would be go 24/7. There's no way that you sign up for the military, you get shipped overseas, and it's just bang, 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 knocking down doors, beating up bad guys, kicking butt and taking names 24/7 the entire time you're going to war. And it's this kind of off time that doesn't get attention from the majority of mainstream entertainment. Most mainstream entertainment is all about the guns, the glamour, the missions. But this book, I felt like, portrayed the other side of war very, I don't know if it's very accurately or very interestingly, in a way that helped me kind of understand that just like anything else, just like if you're working a 9-to-5 job at a corporation, or if you are, going to school and higher education or whatever it is, there is a bureaucracy to things. There's a mission behind the mission for for a large group of individuals who are just trying to move up the ladder and become more important and get recognition and get all of the feel goods that come from things. And then there's a large group of people just trying to sneak under the radar and just get by. And this book does a very good job of just portraying all of the different personalities that go into really any group of individuals. And it just goes to show that that exists within war as well. So it's not always, again, kicking butt and taking names, but there is a lot of other just, I don't want to say goofiness, but it almost is goofiness, like nonsense that goes on in the background that just means almost nothing, but it's important to somebody somewhere and it needs to get done. I remember there's one point in the book, and again, this book did make me laugh a couple times and did make me think, and there were definitely parts that I enjoyed. It's just as the book as a whole was just frustrating. But at one point, there's two, I think they're generals or something arguing, and I'm going to butcher this because I should have written this whole exchange down, and I'm sure it would have been good had I known that I was going to bring it up. But there are two generals arguing, and they're talking about like what they need. And, one general is talking about how his goal is to basically appear like he needs more so that he can gain the recognition of the people in Washington making decisions, and how he doesn't actually need more bombers and he doesn't actually need to, have more men, but his goal is to essentially get the squadrons and men from the other general and acquire them underneath his, his authority, because that makes him more important. And essentially that's his whole goal as a general, is to look important because he doesn't have anything else to do. And it's just, I don't know. I'm butchering that exchange completely, but it was very interesting to see kind of the mission within the mission and the mindset of some individuals and the priorities of some individuals. And I'm sure that a lot of that goes on. And so I think that is probably what Harper Lee meant when she said that it's the only war novel that she's read that's ever made sense. In the fact that for me, it's the only war novel that I've read that takes human kind of greediness and the different personalities of humans and just the overall, what I see in a day-to-day life of humans, and makes that kind of war applicable, if that makes sense. And so it makes the giant war machine make more sense. Another individual who said something very similar, for those of you who are Mormons and who, know your BYU professors, World War II veteran and scholar Hugh Nibley said that it was the most accurate book he had ever read about the military. Again, very interesting. I don't know that accurate would be the right word that I would put it, because it's kind of like overly accurate, that it kind of, it's overly satirical, so it lends itself more onto the absurd side of things, but it's definitely a very accurate portrayal of the differing personalities within war. And I thought that was, very, very interesting. Again, there is little to no actual combat in this book. There's a couple bombing raids that happen, and there is at one or two points, there are some actually a little bit more deep and saddening moments within the book where, individuals and characters within the book die. And so there are moments that try to, kind of ground the book again. And I think those moments are important, again, to kind of make you feel again like, oh yeah, this book does take place during wartime, and that there are high consequences during wartime, and that there are actual consequences to what these generals and what these leaders and what these, different individuals are ordering these soldiers to go and do. Like, there are actual consequences to that. And so those points within the book are important, and they're kind of sobering. But when I say that those points within the book exist, it's a 460-page book, and there are only moments within the book that happens. Most of the book is just continual absurdity. And I liked another review that I read on Goodreads, and I thought that it was a very interesting way to look at this book. And it was from somebody who gave this a 5-star review. And so maybe I'm just not this type of person, but this is what they said. They said, the first thing that came to mind after I read a few chapters of this book was the show Seinfeld. Always touted as a show about nothing, this book was kind of about nothing. It's a series of smaller anecdotes, usually somewhat silly, that really don't have a specific function in moving the plot. It is a satire about war, red tape, chain of command, etc., and the inherent futility involved. While the war and tragedy that goes on, or that goes with it, are usually not considered amusing, it feels therapeutic, tongue-in-cheek poke that needed to be made to maintain sanity. Woof. I don't know what that last sentence said, but I liked his comparison. I liked the comparison that, Seinfeld, there are some people that absolutely love Seinfeld and there are some people who just don't get it. And for me, Seinfeld is one of those shows that I've never really been able to get into. And I probably would like it if I spent more time trying to get into it, but it doesn't come naturally to me. And so that's how I felt about this book. I felt like this is probably one of those books that if I read 2 or 3 times would end up being on my all-time favorites list, and I would absolutely love it. And I would think that, it's incredibly brilliant and transformative. However, on a first run through, it's kind of a book about nothing. I mean, it really is. There's so much in this book that literally means nothing, does nothing, moves the plot forward absolutely nothing. I mean, there really is almost no plot to this book. And I think that's why people love it. And I think that it also, I don't know, maybe it's, as I'm saying this, maybe that was the point. Maybe that was the point, to kind of show the futility of most of what goes on in wartime effort. There's obviously, insane acts of heroism and bravery, and there are very important moments and battles and, times and decisions within war. But there's also a lot of just going through the motions. And I think that there's a lot of a large focus of this book is about generals and commanders who are so obsessed with going through the motions to be perceived as successful and perceived as busy, that they don't mind putting, Yossarian and his crew and some of these lower level infantry individuals, or these lower level, aviators and these lower level soldiers at risk, because they just need something. They need something to appear successful, or something to give off the appearance of being busy and being, making a dent in the war effort. And I think that was well done throughout this book. So overall, I would say that I would rank this book as for importance, I'm honestly going to give it a 4. Maybe I'll change my mind over time. I don't want to rank every book on every top 100 list as a 5 for importance just because somebody else thinks it's important. I think this book is important because of, the critical lens at which it looks at kind of the military industrial complex. There's a section within this book, and again, hopefully I'm not going to butcher this, but there's a large portion of this book that deals with M&M enterprises, and it's one of the soldiers within the book essentially sees the the opportunity on the wall of, all of the kind of the different pieces of enterprise, different pieces of entrepreneurship that he can kind of start dipping his fingers in, and, how in essence, he can use the government to fund and help him achieve his own personal financial goals. And, he grows this massive empire that really at the beginning does a lot of good for some of the soldiers. It allows him to bring in better food and, feed the soldiers better, but it kind of spirals out of control when he ends up shooting at and scheduling, missions that, shoot at his own planes, and then also missions that, fly over and bomb his own soldiers. Again, all for profit, because he is making money on both sides of the war. And he has his fingers kind of dipped into the German side of things, and he has his fingers kind of dipped into the American side of things, and everything becomes a little bit convoluted because, and he rationalizes everything because, what's good for M&M Enterprise is good for America. Because he's making money and he's bringing, wealth and prosperity to soldiers and generals and to Americans and all that kind of stuff. And he's able to justify doing, truly terrible things. And in the book, they try to make light of it, but ultimately he, bombs his own men. And again, I think that that's a very important thing to kind of poke fun of and to, look at from a very critical lens, the fact that, there are kind of, I would say, darker sides to the military industrial complex in which we, provide assistance and provide military and provide funding to groups that, maybe don't always have our best interest at heart, or we end up giving money and weapons and training to groups that end up turning on us and using those exact same money, weapons and everything against us. That there is something more important than profits. And so kind of taking a very kind of critical look at, characters who prioritize profits over everything. I mean, there's other characters who, again, prioritize power over everything, self-preservation over everything. There's lots of different characters that are, like the first review that I read stated that they're very one-dimensional, but they're very, I would say, purposefully one-dimensional. There are a lot of books where one-dimensional characters are a net negative to the story because they don't add any sort of value. You can, guess what their opinions are going to be before they say it. You can, what the reaction is going to be from that character. They don't add any sort of, complex look at life and complex look at decisions because they're, again, very one-dimensional characters. However, in this book, I would say the one-dimensionality of characters is a net positive to the story because Joseph Heller takes that one dimension and takes it from, being 100% of that character to being, 10,000% of that character. And they literally embody that one dimension to the nth degree that it becomes an extreme. And it shows, what would happen if that one dimension, if, profitability, or if the focus on, even stuff as absurd as parades, there's one major who's obsessed with parades, and it's, it's taken kind of, again, to the absurd, and it's, again, it's a very, interesting look at things when, those one dimensions are taken, way, way further than most stories take them. So I don't think that that's a net negative. And so all of that to say, I would give this book a 4 out of 5 on importance. And for engaging, I would give this a 2.5. A 2.5 for me because I enjoyed it while I was reading it. I never wanted to pick it up again when I wasn't reading it. And it took me 3 weeks to get through it. Man. I've been reading a book a week. I've been really good. I've been really, really good about reading a book a week. I've done it for over 50 books now. Almost a full year. I've been reading a book a week. And Catch-22 is the book that broke me. Catch-22 is the first book that's taken me way longer than a week to read, and it's only 460 pages long. I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and The Gulag Archipelago, and there were some other really big books. The Stand by Stephen King. Those are all big books. A couple of those are over 1,000 pages. Read them in a week. crushed them in a week, read them in a week, recorded a podcast episode, edited the episode, posted the episode, crushed it reading those books. Catch-22, 460 pages. This is the book that broke me. I just couldn't get through it. And I'm going to put a little bit of that. Again, I'll take a little bit of ownership. I'm going to put a little bit of that on the fact that I was traveling. I was in Alaska for part of that time. But I've been home from Alaska for a week now. And I was more than halfway done with this book when I got home from Alaska. And it still took me a full week. I finished this book this morning. That's all I'm going to say. I finished this book this morning, and then I got through 1/3 of Flags of Our Fathers because that book is super engaging and fast. And so it just goes to show kind of how hard this book is to get into. And it might not be like that for everybody because reading reviews, some people just absolutely loved it. But I do appreciate it. So I do want to say a 4 out of 5 for importance, a 2.5 out of 5 for engaging. But as far as like my appreciation for this book, I would give this a 5 out of 5 for appreciation. Like I do understand why people love this book. And I do kind of see that this is a book that I could love if I put in the time to try to love it. It's not an easy, this is not an easy fling for me. Catch-22 is going to take some work. It's going to be a slow burner, but I think one day I'm going to come back to this book and I'm going to thoroughly, thoroughly enjoy it. And that's my overall review of this book. I do think that it has its merit. I'm glad that I read it. Would I recommend this book to anybody who likes to read stories? No, this book is not a story book. That's not the way that I would put it. Again, there's little to no plot to this book, honestly. There are individual subplots between characters and there's, some events that happen within the book, but there is no underlining plot within this book. And so, I don't think, for instance, my wife would like this book whatsoever. However, I think this is a book that, again, if you really, really enjoy kind of war culture and you're trying to understand and you'd like, kind of like the satire side of things and you want to understand how maybe soldiers how soldiers kind of look at the bureaucracy of the military, then this, could be a very enjoyable book for you. So if you fall into that group, maybe pick this book up, give it a read. Again, I think that there are some quotes within this book that are going to stick with me forever. There's definitely some elements of this book that I really, really, really did enjoy. But it's a book I'm going to have to read again. And it's hard to do an entire podcast about a book that you just kind of need to reread in order to fully grasp. And obviously I'm not going to be able to reread this again before I record this episode because it took me 3 weeks to read this book one time, dang it. So, thank you for listening to this week's episode of, it's actually not even this week's episode of the Bookly Podcast. Thank you for listening to 2 weeks ago's episode of the Bookly Podcast. I'm going to post this podcast episode as soon as I get this edited, and then we're going to just jump right in. I think so the order moving forward for podcasts, just, as we're getting caught up here, is the next book that I'm supposed to be doing is In Cold Blood. I think we're going to skip over that, and I'm going to do Flags of Our Fathers because this week is the 4th of July, and I want to read Flags of Our Fathers during the 4th of July. I just do. So I'm going to try to get Flags of Our Fathers out this week. Again, I'm about a third of the way done through that book. I imagine that I will be, fairly quick read through that book. It is very entertaining so far. So we're going to skip over In Cold Blood. We're going to go Flags of Our Fathers. Then we're going to come back to In Cold Blood. Hopefully get that one put out by beginning of next week. I'm hoping to record, Monday, similar to Catch-22. Get that one posted. And then we will be on track to do A Man's Search for Meaning on Wednesday. So I'm hoping that in a week and a half, we can post 1, 2, 3, 4 episodes and just be completely caught up. And then we'll go back to reading a book a week. That's the goal. A couple of these books are a little bit shorter. I believe Flags of Our Fathers is not terribly long, and A Man's Search for Meaning should take me an evening to read. So I think it's all going to be possible, but just bear with me. Sorry for the delay in the podcast. Hopefully we'll get this one up and running, this episode up and running quickly, and we'll get the next couple episodes put out. And then as soon as we get caught up again, my goal is to start pumping out a few more of those short episodes. For those of you who don't have 45 minutes to an hour to listen to me ramble about books and how I feel. Also, if you are interested in coming on the podcast, please reach out. I would love to have you on an episode of the podcast. I'd, love to get anybody in the podcasting room. I think, we've done a pretty good job, again, getting this thing up and running, getting mics and stuff like that. So, would love to get you up here reading a book with me. Otherwise, we can always do remote. So let me know if you're interested in reading any of the books coming up. Otherwise, be on the lookout for a bunch of episodes coming out here pretty soon. And we'll see you next time on the Bookly Podcast. Thanks for listening.